and the neighbors call it a divine providence, as hundreds of Indians died. There's briefly talk of moving Brainerd's mission to the Susquehanna, where Brainerd occasionally does mission work. The guy moves around quite a bit. He's always on his horse, and he's moving back and forth all the time preaching. So by 1755, Morris, the guy who sued them at Bethel, his case is passed favorably to the courts, and the Indians are literally evicted from Bethel. There's a very good chance that the onset of the French and Indian War the year before and renewed apprehension about savages in the neighborhood had quite a bit to do with them being kicked out. So the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, you might see there that does not equal 7. That's from 1754 and 1763. It starts sooner here. There are a couple of years where it's really the French and the British kind of going at it about Ohio, the Ohio Valley, and then the technical war starts between the great powers of the time. So it's the day's equivalent sort of a world war between powers, and ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, when France winds up giving up all their rights to all land east of the Mississippi. So in North America, it's ostensibly a battle for control of territory and settlement, and the infinite markets of the New World, seemingly infinite, beginning particularly with the forks of the Ohio River, the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. So the British attempt to wrest control of the Ohio River Valley from the French, and actually one of the very first battles involved this man, George Washington. It was the Battle of Jumonville, I think, was one of the first battles of the French and Indian War, and Washington was a part of it. So the French are heavily reliant on Native American allies, and various tribes aligned with either the British or the French. And the British are largely supported by the Iroquois Confederation in the north, and the Lenape, having seen what it gets them to trust the British, joined with the French against the British, along with the Shawnee and the Ojibwe. This is a contemporary oil painting of a Lenape chief who was heavily involved in what ultimately would be the French and Indian War. The Lenape gave the British a really difficult time. They were experts in guerrilla warfare, experts on the terrain, and it led to the British reaching out basically to tribes that were hostile to them, and as well as the Iroquois, their allies, to act as mediators at major conferences like Crosswicks, and the gathering that generated the Treaty of Easton in late 1758. And these two conferences, particularly the Treaty of Easton, are what sort of lead to the establishment of Brotherton. The Indians from Bethel in 1755 felt particularly threatened, scattered, and some tried making their way back to Crosswicks. Some of the remaining Bethel group actually petitioned the governor for protection, and a law was passed that said all Indians had to register with the province and wear a red ribbon in their hair if they were a friend of the English. Brainerd, meanwhile, is working behind the scenes with the Society in Scotland for propagating Christian knowledge, and the Synod to try acquiring property for the remaining members of the Bethel and Crosswick groups. At that point, 1754, there was an effort to secure about 4,000 acres, which ultimately failed. Brainerd failed at acquiring that land. He was officially dismissed by the Synod from Bethel in 1755, and the excuse was that his wife's frailty and health was making him a lesser preacher, so they pulled him and sent him west. So with the advent of the French and Indian War, the Indian mission movement intensifies somewhat as worries about New Jersey Indians joining those in Pennsylvania begin to rise. Frankly, the missions become sort of holding areas or camps where natives can be controlled and ultimately surveilled. And while he is centered at Bethel, he's also a pastor of a church in Newark. This is John Brainerd, and he's ministering on the fly at multiple locations, even making multiple trips, again, after he was let go at Bethel, out to as far as the Susquehanna River. In 1757, Brainerd's wife dies, his son and one of his daughters dies the following year, and this is about the time where Brotherton appears on the radar. The Treaty of Easton, 1758. Both the Crosswicks Conference and the Treaty of Easton occur. The Crosswicks Conference results in the set-aside of the Brotherton parcel, And the Treaty of Easton results in a sort of ceasefire between the British and the Lenape and their allies in the West, with the English promising to limit their expansion and settlement in the Ohio Valley and West. The minutes from the Treaty of Easton are incredible, and they're online, and you can go on and read these things. And just the descriptions of the conversations between the British kind of politicians and these tribal members, it's fascinating to read. And there's a lot of exchanging of wampum, and like really sort of deep philosophical discussions about friendship and and trust, and it's amazing to read, but it's kind of hard to read too, when you consider what came after. So the treaty notes, I say, are a spectacular example of the subtle, complex diplomatic and bargaining skills of the Iroquois and a host of other tribes, including a gentleman named Tiescon, who was a major chieftain of the Lenape. They had always reminded me, the notes reminded me of a William Penn quote where he described the Lenape as master diplomats and thinkers, and that if they had all the information in a case, no man could best them in their oratory and analytical skills. And that really is reflected in those minutes. I definitely recommend you check them out. So, Brotherton Reservation is located in present-day Chemung Township, as you know. What does Chemung mean?
We all know that. It means
it's land of the big horn.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Ashomong. It's on the placemat at Manny's.
What's that?
It's on the placemat at Manny's. Remember, at Indian Mill.
And so the area is called Edgepillock, right? And which is the place of pure or clear water, and that's the name of the parcel that eventually becomes Brotherton is Edgepillock. Reservation lasts a total of 44 years until 1802, and that's the year that the remaining inhabitants that were there packed up their stuff and headed for New York. This is one of the original survey maps of the area, and unfortunately, even if that were not blurred, it would be very difficult to read. But it says the surveyor wrote down here, by overcrowd of affairs, I precipitously marked out the 10 houses in ye line of each lot, whereas it should have been in ye middle. The 2 houses next to ye water, with the adjacent field of about 4 or 5 acres, is proposed for ye supply of poor widows only. The above may give ye governor some idea how it lies. I wish I could have done it better. And as it turns out later on, he did kind of do a bad job, because it was an extra 400 to 500 acres that he had not accounted for when he did the survey. So the area was chosen strategically in part to isolate these good Christian Indians from the influence of the bad Indians in the wilds during the remainder of the French and Indian War. So out of the Crosswicks Conference comes a proposition for the Lenape to have a tract of land set aside for them in assurance for the renunciation of all land claims south of the Raritan River. The tract here is owned by a gentleman named Benjamin Springer. There's still a Springer's Brook that runs through a portion of the parcel, as I'm sure you know. The parcel was originally calculated at about 3,044 acres. It's later divided up in 1802. It's discovered to be about 3,400 acres. Tract is situated 20 miles from Burlington, approximately, and approximately 15 miles from Mount Holly. Charles Reed of Batstow fame was the commissioner at the time, and he writes, "We have purchased a tract of land for the Indians extremely convenient for them, about 200 or 2,500 acres, and have this day sent a surveyor to survey a parcel of wild natural meadow near the place where they can cut their hay, and directed him to take up 500 acres of it. They can in a day come from the sea within 5 miles of this place with clams and oysters. There are 300 bearing apple trees on it, and 24 acres of good Indian corn, which we propose to lay down with rye, and this will be their first year's provisions on their removal. The deed states that it's constructed in the name of the governor and commissioners, and they are the heirs and trust for the use of the Indians. There's a clause in the deed that states that no one could use, lease, or sell land associated with the parcel, and any non-white that attempted to settle or encroach on the resources of the community could be forcibly removed by a judge or a justice of the peace. So initially there were about 200 Indians, 200 Lenape that wind up living at Brotherton. In 1759, the governor of the province, Francis Bernard, writes about having gone to Brotherton to scope it out and notes very good soil, large hunting grounds, saw house being erected, and lots of land being cleared for tillage. He also notes conspicuously that Brotherton is decidedly out of the way of communication with wild Indians. Money for startup and upkeep almost immediately becomes an issue, and you find several of the Indian commissioners as well as the synod pitching in funds early on to get structures built. That influx of, or inflow of money that starts in the beginning trickles to a halt very quickly, and the place just begins to go downhill. I would say pretty fast, even before John Brainerd actually dies. A conference with the chiefs initially indicated that they were very happy about what had been done for them. And one would imagine that they were not going to say they weren't happy, because that would have been probably trouble. So Jonathan Brainerd, at the time that the Brotherton parcel was purchased, is working as a chaplain for the British Army during the French and Indian War, and he's stationed in New York now, near the Canadian border. He's asked to take up the ministerial duties at Brotherton, and he comes to live there in November of 1759. Brainerd early on writes about his hopes for the reservation. I hope to prevent their running 12 or 15 miles to the inhabitants for everything they want, whereby they not only consume much time, but often fall into the temptation of calling at dram houses, where they intoxicate themselves with spirituous liquors, and after some days, perhaps instead of hours, return home wholly unfit for anything relating either to this or a future world. It's probably a really nice way of saying hungover.
Yeah.
So when they were drinking at the same bars and things that the iron workers were at?
The taverns that were
the same
on the stagecoach routes.
Yep. And they would call them dram houses. And I mean, there's some indication that folks that lived at Brotherton were actually working in Atslayan.
Okay.
And though that's not proven, it's sort of in the history books, but there's no documentation that's really been found. They probably were. And so they were drinking with people that were working, at the mills and certainly working at the foundries and whatnot. But that's the thing that's funny to me, right? Is that there's this caricaturization of the Lenape as drunks, and you got to be careful because they'll go into a dram house if they see one, but everybody else is too.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't say Lenape only dram house. So one of the first things that Brainerd does is he tries to acquire funds for an Indian school on the reservation. And this was a huge part. This is the beginning of the denativizing program of Native American groups. And it's a bit of a shameful thing in our history. Children were more often than not forcibly taken from their parents at a very young age, shipped off to Europeanized schools, and indoctrinated into the European educational system, as well as converted, of course, to Christianity. So Brainerd wanted to establish a school there at Brotherton that rivaled the one in Connecticut, where he had established a relationship with the headmaster and frequently sent some of his own charges north to attend. He comes to Brotherton with the idea that his Indians can finally become completely self-sufficient here. He also notes that many of his group have enlisted in the Army and fought and died on the frontier for the British Army. And that's really a story that needs to be told too. Just finding out who the folks were, the Native Americans were that fought in these early wars. It's got to be done, I think. So funding becomes a problem early on. The Synod of New York and Philadelphia attempt to fund projects on the reservation. Brainerd continues to send select children to Indian school in Norwich to become missionaries to other Indian groups. We have documentary evidence of a couple of these kids. There's one named Miriam Storr, who was described by Brainerd as an amiable child, savingly converted at the age of 3. There's an Elizabeth Quayla, who is a pretty behaved child, but nothing respecting her is in any way remarkable. So this denativization program that really kind of starts with Brainerd and Brotherton, and I just want to go far ahead for a moment, but I'm sure you've all heard of the Carlisle Indian School.
Yeah.
So this denativization program basically continues into the late 19th century. And these are just a few examples of some of the charges at Carlisle particularly. This young man here, his name is Tom Torlino, who is his European name And he was a Navajo breed. You can see they changed it, you know, and they even whitened his skin in the photograph. It's kind of hard to see in the photograph. But here you have a bunch of Shawnee girls who came and were Christianized and Europeanized. And the motto at Carlisle was "Kill the Indian and save the man." It was pretty harsh. So, by the 1760s, with funding becoming increasingly scarce, Brainerd is actively complaining that the governor has not provided him with a house or a church as promised. Archaeologically, we think we might know where his house was on this property. That's something archaeologically that we're going to have to investigate. But there's conflicting reports of the house having a foundation and also being an earth-fast house, so it was built right on the ground. We're not really sure, so that's why we have to dig.
And where is that?
What's that?
Where is that located?
Well, Brainerd's house may or may not be in that agricultural field that I mentioned earlier that's just south of Willow Grove Avenue. So right where the brook, Indian Spring Brook?
Springer's.
Yeah, Springer's Brook. It's just, yeah, right where that comes through there on the eastern portion of that ag field across from where the new cemetery is. You know the new cemetery there that's north of Willow Grove Road? Yeah. So we think that it's there. We think that it's in the eastern portion of that agricultural field. And we actually went out and did a ground penetrating radar survey at the end of last year. And there do seem to be some anomalies in the ground. We're not quite sure what they are yet. They may be remnants of the old road that had gone through there, like Willow Grove Avenue or Willow Grove Road is fairly straight now. But in the old maps, it looks like it kind of went down like this and then looped up back again near to where the sawmill is. So the ground penetrating radar may have found some signatures of that old road, which would be very, very interesting to excavate and find. And there are other anomalies that we can't really tell what they are, and they would have to be ground truth. So we would have to put holes in the ground to kind of see exactly what they were. But there seem to be some things going on there subsurface that could be potentially very interesting. So more to come on that. So Brainerd's actively complaining about the governor. His salary is almost 40 pounds a year. He finds himself using his own money to assist the group at Brotherton when funds really trickle to the hall. Funding requests that he makes for the reservation are repeatedly shot down and commissioned by the Quakers, again, who disapprove of the Presbyterian evangelical kind of style. In 1762, the Indians at Brotherton actually petitioned the New Jersey Assembly to have debts forgiven that they couldn't pay because their mill had burned down. It's not clear how it burned down. We know that they were harassed quite a bit again by neighbors, so the mill may have been burned down by folks trying to make their life more difficult. Brainerd also begins to minister to poor white groups in the area, and again, as he's constantly on horseback. As a contemporary of Brainerd notes, his position as an Indian missionary was very trying. He loved his Indians too well to leave them, but they were just too few to justify the appropriation of all his time and energy. Brainerd spending less and less time at Brotherton, and whatever protection he might have afforded the community begins to unravel in his absence. The members of the Brotherton community are resistant to adopting a fully European lifestyle, particularly European agricultural methods. And by 1767, the Brotherton group is already being invited to come out west and live with a Delaware group that's kind of set up in Ohio. By 1768, Brainerd leaves Brotherton as his primary place of residence and moves to Mount Holly, where he gathers a congregation, builds a church, builds a house, a schoolhouse, and he settles down a bit there for a while with his new wife. Certainly money had something to do with it, almost certainly his health. He was a very sickly guy, like his brother. And the guy was just constantly on the move. I don't know how he did it. So Brainerd appears to have left Mount Holly at some point, gone back to Brotherton in 1775, and stayed there teaching to a greatly diminished group of Lenape until about 1777. The conditions at Brotherton by the 1770s have become pretty precarious with the lack of funding, the absence of Brainerd most of the time, and the constant harassment by locals. The advent of the Red War leaves the Brotherton group even more isolated and funless, and add to this the fact that these people are just like completely traumatized. Imagine for a moment that an alien culture appears out of virtually nowhere, wipes out an entire generation or more through disease simply by appearing on the scene, and then sets to the task of systematically dismantling everything about your culture, from family traditions to religion to politics. And if you resist, you and your family are in danger of being killed outright. Imagine the kinds of concessions that you would have to make to yourself, the things that you would have to find a way to justify in your head simply to survive. Surveilled in manageable groups, your children taken away from you on a regular basis, poison introduced into your communities in the form of alcohol to make you more manageable, and reify all the hostile ideas that others have of you. So these folks are pretty traumatized, I think, sitting there on the landscape. 1771, the Brotherton group is living in abject poverty, petitions the government to allow them to lease some of their land to white farmers to bring money into the community, but they're denied. The Commonwealth denies them. 1777, a traveler named John Hunt visits the group at Brotherton and describes that he found them in low circumstances as to food and raiment, naked children running everywhere, and rampant drunkenness. This is also the year that John Brainerd moves permanently from Brotherton to Deerfield in Cumberland County? Yeah. Brainerd dies there in 1781. So no one is picked to replace him. An itinerant minister named Dan Simon preaches here in 1783, but he is ultimately suspended for immorality. I couldn't find what that meant. God knows what that meant. In 1795, a journal is published penned by a German traveler named Johann Ferdinand Altenreich, who visits the reservation in 1794. It is probably the most vivid eyewitness account that we have of conditions at the reservation near its end from an eyewitness. And I guess I'd kind of like to read this excerpt to you. Interesting. So this is from 1795, a description of a short walking tour in the province of New Jersey. The land already belonged to the Indians and was less sandy and of better quality than that we had seen up to this point. Nice winding paths, like an English park, led to the individual residences of the Indians. On a tilled, fenced-in field, just like the log house standing on it, was entirely European-American in manner, even having fruit trees, and there resided their leader, whose name was Skicket. In him we found a tall, well-proportioned old man with black hair, small blackish-brown eyes, and with a complexion that was not coppery red, as seldom as was the case with some Iroquois I had the chance to see in Philadelphia. But his skin was yellow or mulatto-colored, not having the blackish shade present among those. He had some red of old age on his cheeks. His physiognomy did not deviate much from the European one. His cranium was large, the thick brow of his forehead was protruded strongly, and therefore made the not so large nose appear indented at its beginning. His wife was of the same height. She might have been approximately 40 years old or more. She too had the same complexion, but without the slightest red on her cheeks. Shiny black hair, small black eyes, her forehead narrowed upwardly. Her cheekbones were prominent, and through this and through her chin, her face in a way had a quadrangular appearance. This Asiatic trace struck me all the more as I already had noticed it in the skull of a Wabash Indian woman. Men never have this feature, but always a more rounded, bigger, more strongly projected in the middle of the sides and in the back of their skulls. Soon afterwards, in another house in the neighborhood, we saw a boy of about 13 years. This one had the same yellow complexion, without red color, black hair, a broad face, small black eyes with distinctly slanting, close-set eyes. Consequently, like among North America's almost adjacent neighbors, the Asiatic peoples. In addition, in the boy's house, we saw two old women of much darker, as if smoked complexion. In the same house were two young Indian women who hid themselves upon our arrival, so we couldn't set eyes upon them. All those Indians we saw were dressed like white Americans. Even the old man no longer tore his beard out and had begun to shave his still growing beard in European fashion. We conversed with this principal person who spoke English, as all of them did. Their own language is pronounced entirely in the throat, like the German or the Swiss, and is very rough. This one they still use among themselves, by the way. Although he was able to read and write and seemed to be a reasonable man, Skicket's conversation was very poor, though he spoke slowly and only a little, and when not asked, he sat there as if in deep contemplation. Already having been far removed from their natural ways of living for many years, All activities seem to have died away among these Indians, still cultivated too little and not out of idleness. They have begun to scorn agriculture, and they often lease their land for cultivation now. At best, they weave baskets and make brooms, which they carry to the market in Philadelphia. They have entirely forgotten their old occupations. They do not even yield the tomahawk anymore. This lack of mental stimulation and their totally inactive way of life is probably the main reason that their numbers are obviously dwindling. Only about 9 families are said to remain, among which there is also a family of a New England Indian, whose tongue they themselves do not even understand, and with whom they must speak English. The whites living at some distance, and who no longer see as many Indians as before, maintain their younger people desert to the warring Indians of the backlands. Out of envy for their possessions, on the whole, they have a treacherous spite against this remainder of rightful owners. The land transferred to them for their settlement is called Edgepillock, and is said to comprise 3,000 acres. Except for not being allowed to sell it, they have complete command over it. They can sell lumber and even lease the land if they choose. It does not seem as if they have divided the land into certain allotments among themselves. The common authorities judge their quarrels with whites. Their own disputes they do not sue for, and none takes them into account. Many people remember that some years ago an Indian whose father had been murdered took revenge in a manner that was law among them. All of a sudden he took a knife and stabbed his enemy with whom he was drinking in a local pub. He pursued him out the door as he escaped and knocked his brain out with a stone. They are all nominally Christians. They have a wooden chapel where an itinerant preacher still preached to them a year ago. We started out again after our Indian and his wife had drunken up the greater part of the bottle of rum with as much indifference as others would have done with a glass of water. I would have liked receiving anything special of some kind from him, but neither a stone axe nor a chisel nor any other kind of antiquity was possible to obtain among these people. Neither songs nor even their former war chant did this headman know. I only found a trace of an old tradition of their sacrifices with him. At the change of the moon, it is said, a long hut was constructed and 3 deer were slaughtered around it, which the people danced. So that's what it looked like in Brotherton in the late 18th century. By the late 18th century, the Quakers, who for decades had shot down the funding for the reservation because of their ideological feud with the Presbyterians, again start trying to make some kind of half-hearted efforts to pump funds into the reservation. In 1796, another petition was placed before the state government to appoint commissioners to lease land for the benefit of the Indians. And women of the group were actively engaged in selling traditional crafts to bring money into the community. Of course, I would not even mention Indian Anne. She was born in 1804, though, which is after Brotherton was vacated. So again, Jacob Skeket, who was mentioned in that last account, he seems to have stepped up as the head of the group, and he appears to be the tribal representative for them. In 1801, the Brotherton group receives an invitation from a Mohican group known as the Stockbridge, who lived near Oneida Lake, and their invitation read, which is actually on a sign along Willow Grove Road: "Pack up your mat and come eat out of your dish, or eat out of our dish. Our necks are stretched in looking towards the firesides of our grandfathers until they are as long as cranes." Many of the Brotherton group were moved by the invitation and subsequently petitioned the legislature for the ability to sell the reservation lands for them so they could use the proceeds to move themselves up to Oneida Lake. Commissioners were appointed to divide the Brotherton Reservation tract into lots no more than 100 acres and sell them at public sale, with the caveat that three-quarters of the remaining Indians at Brotherton actually consented to it. That was the caveat. The state government commissioners actually went out to Brotherton to see how many people agreed, and at that time there were 63 adult Indians remaining in the community, and 46 were present at the time the commissioners visited. 38 signed the petition there, and 8 additional signed the petition in March in Trenton. Even though only 46 signed, which was less than 3/4 required, the governor passed the petition through. And so in 1802, this advertisement appeared in regional papers: "To be sold, land in timber, pine, maple, hickory, red oak, and cedar, a sawmill in good repair, a good seat where a mill had been, a dam, cedar swamp, orchards, a number of horses, most land uncultivated." So the sale began on the 10th of May, and by August, only half of the reservation land was left unsold. So it started kind of, the parcels went quick. Property was sold to about 25 different people at $2 to $5 per acre. As earlier indicated, the proceeds of the sale were used in large part to hire drivers and wagons to transport the last of them north, basically to New Stockbridge, about 275, 300 miles.
What year was that?
1802 is when they left. So this is an illustration, which I guess you can't really see very well, of them leaving. And there's one final eyewitness account that is recorded at the time of their departure. Their scanty furniture, their rude Indian relics and treasures, the aged, the sick, and the little ones were all packed in the vehicles, and the healthy marched on foot, whistling aloud to keep their courage up, or in defiance of their painful destiny, the cavalcade moved off to the music of violins. And the last indignity was the fact that on the way up to Stockbridge, the group camped in Bethel on their way up, and then made their way up to Stockbridge, and are now part of the Stockbridge-Muncie tribe. But that's basically it. That's just kind of the story of the Brotherton Reservation in a very encapsulated nutshell. There's so much more, but it would take forever to kind of go into it.
Very interesting.
I hope that wasn't too boring.
Indian Ann
No, not at all.
returned, right?
What's that?
Indian Ann came back. Did she come back?
Well, she was born in 1804, so I think that she was probably, born to parents that were associated with the reservation, but had stayed behind. A few people probably did stay behind. There are definitely accounts of some folks that just didn't want to leave. They didn't want to sign off on the legislation that would have sold the land.
Now, John Brainerd went to Deerfield, where he died in 1781, I think it was.
Yes.
Thereabouts. And he went there about 1777, I think you said, right?
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible that he did have built this church down here in Tabernacle? Because our sign says it was built in 1779 by Brainerd, but he wasn't here at the time.
Yeah. He was back and forth. I mean,
Okay, so.
I really don't know.
In Deerfield, I thought in Deerfield he was pretty ill down there, and he really didn't do much other than, I think he was with the Presbyterian Church down there, and he might have done some schematic services or something, but
Yeah.
I didn't think he was moving around a whole lot then.
Yeah, by the time he got to Deerfield, he wasn't.
Yeah.
He was pretty sick, but he was always sick. But
Yeah,
he was at
yeah.
the point where he was not.
So-
He couldn't do what he had done before.
So it is possible that he did have responsibility for putting this church together in
I guess it's possible. I mean, I honestly can't say one way or the other. I don't know that he did or didn't.
Yeah.
But it's something I could look into.
Yeah, I'm wondering where that came from, because
Yeah.
somebody, somewhere along the line 50 years ago, when the sign went up, said, he built that church in 1789. And it almost seems like it's not possible, but
Yeah.
it could have been.
Yeah.
Could have been.
Okay. Yeah.
I think, there's a lot in what you said. I really appreciate the introduction